Hey, guess what? Corporations are not people. If you are a corporation and you get into trouble, you cannot go to prison as a corporation. I mean, sure, your executive office or something maybe can go to prison, but in terms of you as a corporation, paying for your crimes is usually literally paying for your crimes. You pay money, you pay a fine. So our Happy Friday pop quiz tonight is this. What is the single largest fine ever imposed on a corporation in the United States? What is the largest amount of money that any U.S. court has ever made a company pay for its crimes? The answer? Ding. $4.5 billion. $4.5 billion to be paid by the company that does not want you to pronounce the petroleum in their name. They just want you to call them by their initials, BP. They want you to think of this green sunflower when you think of them and not say British Petroleum. The giant oil company BP earned the bragging rights for being charged the largest fine ever in American history. They earned it in part for lying. BP, of course, caused the largest accidental oil spill in world history 3 years ago this week, and their full culpability for that spill is still being worked out, along with all the other companies that are responsible. They're currently on trial right now in New Orleans. But the BP lying part of it, that part has already been adjudicated. BP admitted in court that while they were saying publicly, and saying to Congress even, that their gushing well in the Gulf of Mexico was only leaking 5,000 barrels a day, that was it, merely a flesh wound. While they were saying that publicly, not only was that wrong, but they knew it was wrong. BP, as a company, internally was having all sorts of discussions about how it wasn't 5,000 barrels a day. It was more like 60,000 barrels, or maybe even 140,000 barrels a day. But publicly, they kept assuring everybody that really it was no big deal. It was only 5. The important part was not just that BP was wrong, or that they didn't know the answer and they were guessing. The important part in their culpability, of course, the reason they ended up paying the largest corporate fine in the history of corporate fines was not because they got it wrong. It's because they did know what the truth was, and they lied about it. They lied about it publicly. They lied about it to Congress. In the 3 years since the worst oil spill ever, there has been a slow unfolding in the courts and in the Gulf of things that we, the public, did not know at the time of the spill. These big unanswered questions that we had at the time of the spill, some of them, it turns out, the oil companies actually knew what the truth was and were just keeping the truth from us. But some of those unanswered questions, yeah, it's 3 years down the road, and maybe now we are starting to learn the truth now, but we still don't know if the oil companies knew it all along and they were keeping it from us all this time, or if they have been in the dark until now just like we were. Well, this week, Newsweek published some remarkable new reporting on the question that I, frankly, was asked the most when I was down at the Gulf covering this story. The worry that was expressed to me the most by people who live on the Gulf Coast and who make their living on the water there 3 years ago in the middle of that spill. This was what those folks worried about more than anything. And now, 3 years later, we are starting to get some answers about it. For now, crews are relying on the tried and true method of chemical dispersants. These are chemicals you've seen dusted over the oil slick. BP has already sprayed 160,000 gallons of dispersant on the oil slick, not to mention the 6,000 gallons pumped down to the leak well beneath the surface of the ocean. That's more dispersant than has ever been used on any oil spill ever. The chemicals in the dispersants are themselves toxic. Probably. We don't really know what's in them.
What are the long-term impacts of breathing this, of touching the oil, of touching the dispersant? These are all questions that nobody really knows the answer to. And so we need scientific data. We need doctors down here to help people when they do come in contact with this.
One of the response technologies that has been so controversial for this disaster, Congressman, is the issue of dispersants. And one of the complications in around dispersants is the fact that dispersants are seen as proprietary technology, that the companies who make them don't disclose what's in them.
We cannot allow for these companies to be using dispersants, chemicals, in ways that could ultimately have profound impacts on not only the food that is provided from that region, from the fishing, but also the impact that it could ultimately have upon human beings.
Are you also hearing concerns voiced about the long-term impacts of dispersants? That's one thing that I know a lot of fishermen, when I was down there, were talking to me about, and the government essentially still saying now, yeah, they're doing long-term studies, but they don't know.
Right, very much so. They don't know the long-term impacts, and that's what really scares people here.
That's what really scares people. Well, now, 3 years down the road, some of those very ominous unanswered questions that were being asked down on the Gulf Coast when that spill was happening and when they were dumping all that dispersant into the sea to make it better, some of those questions are finally starting to be answered. Joining us now is Mark Hertsgaard. He's an independent journalist. He's a contributor for the Daily Beast. His latest article for Newsweek is called What BP Doesn't Want You to Know About the 2010 Gulf Spill. Mark, thanks very much for joining us. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I know you've been in the Gulf Coast talking to folks who came into physical contact with this dispersant, which is called Corexit. What did you find?
That people are still suffering from this, and that the illnesses at the time were very, very severe. Basically, an odd combination of illnesses, striking the skin, the lungs, and the brain all at once. And above all, what I found was that BP knew this at the time. BP was told that this Corexit dispersant, told by the manufacturer of Corexit exactly what was in those chemicals, what chemicals were in there, and that the workers and anyone who came in contact with it, this was extremely hazardous stuff, and that they needed protective gear, they needed training and information, and BP buried that report in order to further its goal of basically making the oil appear to disappear, to cover up this oil spill and to get it off of TV screens and the front pages.
Well, that has always been one of the political conundrums, thinking about the use of dispersant, literally from a political perspective. There is an impact to seeing oil that is lessened if you don't see the oil, even if it's still there, and it's maybe been made into something that you can't see by addition of another chemical that might be just as toxic. But isn't there an argument to be made for using dispersants simply for the purpose of breaking the oil down, like they say, dispersing it, allowing it to be exposed more to the elements that might make it might make the spill actually go away faster?
Well, to be fair, I interviewed the EPA administrator, Lisa Jackson, who was in charge at that time, and that was exactly what she said. She said, we faced a choice between bad and worse. We did not like the idea of this Corexit dispersant, but we thought that it was better to apply it in order to keep the oil from hitting the coastlines, to keep it from hitting the beaches and the oyster beds and so forth. And EPA Administrator Jackson also said that the National Commission appointed by President Obama to look into this did not find fault, quote unquote, with the decision to use dispersant. So hardly a ringing endorsement of it, but not finding fault. But let's remember, EPA did not have the legal authority to force BP not to use this. Administrator Jackson wrote them a letter, we write about this in the story, on May 19th, asking them to stop using this toxic dispersant. But she did not have the authority to force them to stop it, and BP wrote back the next day and essentially said, sorry, we're going to continue.
The people who were made sick by exposure to Corexit, and again, a lot of the ways they were made sick were exactly the ways, as you point out in your reporting, that were predicted or described by the company that makes it, which is why they said that they should be used in such careful ways. Are the people who were made sick by this chemical seeking redress? What are they trying to do in order to get their medical expenses covered? And are they covered in some of the settlements with Gulf Coast residents that cover the rest of the oil spill? Yeah,
they're trying, Rachel, but it's going to be an uphill path because, now, you know, BP set aside last year roughly $8 billion for medical claims. But unfortunately, most of the illnesses that these people are suffering from are not covered under that settlement. And that's partly because they were not well represented by the plaintiffs' committee, the attorneys who are handling that. And so it's a kind of a tragedy that goes on. Some of them have already taken buyouts from BP, but they're getting paid pennies on the dollar, and it's $60,000, and their medical bills are way beyond that. And so, you know, I think that was part of the reason that I felt so strongly about getting this story out, is that these people were basically treated as collateral damage by BP. As part of BP's cover-up, they were willing to sacrifice the health of these workers, hundreds and possibly thousands of them, and also coastal residents. A little 3-year-old boy we write about in this story who was fine until he started breathing this stuff in, and now he got terribly sick. And let's not forget the Gulf ecosystem, where 33%, one-third of the seafood that we Americans eat, come out of that Gulf. And that, too, was terribly damaged by this use of Corexit, which is an Orwellian term, by the way, if I've ever heard one, Corexit, as a name for a dispersant. Once you put that with oil, it becomes 52 times more toxic.
Mark Hertzgaard, contributor for the Daily Beast, also the author of Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth. Mark, this is an important story. Thanks for your reporting on this. Thanks for taking time to talk with us about it tonight.
Thanks for airing it.
I appreciate it. All right. Are you a deeply suspicious person, but you can't seem to find your soulmate? I have some very bad advice for you just ahead.